Greetings, everybody. Peter Martinez here. I want to welcome you all to City Lights on behalf of the City Lights Foundation and the City Lights booksellers and publishers to this very auspicious occasion. Before we begin, as always, I want to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from unceded ancestral grounds of the Ohlone peoples, also known as the Bay Area. To those of you who are watching us on Zoom, greetings from wherever you are. Today is auspicious on many reasons and many counts. First, it is our very first in-store event since the start of the pandemic. Secondly, we are celebrating a publication of one of our own books. City Lights, of course, as many of you know, is also a publisher as well as a bookstore. And very importantly, it is the latest installment in the historic Pocket Poet series. So, we're going to remind all of you that are watching online, we're going to be posting links with which you may purchase the book. They are signed editions tonight. They're very excited. So we're delighted to welcome back into the house Will Alexander. We're celebrating number 63 in the Pocket Poet series. It's called Divine Blue Light for John Coltrane. City Lights has had a long-standing relationship with Will that dates back all the way to when Philip Lamantia used to be with us here in the store. Will and Philip were very close friends, and surrealism is a very important influence in Will's work. His poems are often located in that intersection between surrealism and afro-futurism, but are also in and of themselves, kind of a showcase of Will's very unique, very innovative voice in the pantheon of the contemporary poetry. So Will Alexander is also a novelist, a playwright, a philosopher, a visual artist, and a musician, a really amazing keyboardist. He has published over 24 books in a variety of genres, and he has earned many honors and awards for his work. He is currently the poet in residence at Beyond the Rope in Venice, California. He's a lifelong resident of Los Angeles. So joining him tonight is going to be Tongo Eisen-Martin. Tongo got caught in traffic. He is on his way, so hopefully we'll get to hear from him before this is all over. Such a great double bill. But before we start, I want to bring out now Garrett Caples, who is the editor of Divine Blue Light. To say a few words, Garrett is the poetry editor here at City Lights, the curator of the Pocket Poet series, as well as the Spotlight Poetry series. Also a really amazing poet in his own right. So join us now in giving them both a big welcome.
Thanks, everyone. I wrote this intro, and just, I'm pretty sure Tongo will get here through the traffic, so I'm just going to introduce them both of them at the same time. So tonight's a very special night at City Lights for many reasons, not the least of which is the fact that we have in the house two most recent Pocket Poets authors, Tongo Eisen-Martin and Will Alexander. Such a bill suggests the Pocket Poets remains among the most explosive poetry series in the United States, some 67 years after it began with Pictures of the Gone World by our late founder, Lawrence Getty. Lawrence was a revolutionary poet publisher from the beginning, following up with volumes by the two rabble-rousing Kenneths, Erectile Compaction, before launching the hand grenade of Howell and other poems by Allen Ginsberg, which moved the 20th century wide open. That sonic boom is still reverberating today, and by a miracle of fate, City Lights is still here causing trouble. With Will Alexander and Tongo Eisen-Martin on our list, we can say we're carrying on Lawrence's mission at the highest levels of poetry being written today. Let's send a shout out to our friend Derek Fenner of Bootstrap Press, who put out Tongo's first book, Someone's Dead Already, back in 2015. They'd met working with marginalized youth at Juvenile Hall in Oakland, and were later teaching such students at Contra Costa College. One day, a student asked Tongo if he was truly a poet, and Tongo replied off the top of his head with his poem, Blood in My Eye, which knocked Derek so far out he immediately asked if he would see a manuscript. Certainly, this book put Tongo on our radar at City Lights, and it wasn't long before our director, Elaine Katzenberger, called him live and immediately asked if she could see a manuscript. Like when Lawrence first heard Ginsberg read Howell. Tongo provokes some kind of strong instant reactions because he was a phantasmagoric imagination and a righteous passion for social and racial justice with a staggering virtuosity of performance. Conventional wisdom says performance poetry doesn't hold up on the page, but Tongo takes its conventional wisdom, hits it so hard in the ass that his last thing over the included. Lawrence, of course, never believed in this wisdom, or he wouldn't have published Bob Kaufman and Van Waldman in the Pocket Poet series. And so he was extremely fortunate to have published Tongo's revolutionary work, first in Heaven Is All Goodbye, and most recently, Blood in the Fog. And we're happy he's helping us celebrate number 63 of the Pocket Poet series, Divine Blue Light for John Coltrane by Will Alexander. Will's route to the Pocket Poet series has been more circuitous. He's been in the general orbit of City Lights since the late 70s, visiting North Beach to meet Bob Kaufman and Philip Lamantia, another Pocket Poets legend. I've been lucky enough to know Will for almost 30 years. Andrew Jordan introduced us in 1995 when we were publishing Will's first collection, Stratospheric Canticles. 3 years later, Will introduced me to Lamantia and initiated a chain of events that would eventually find me becoming an editor at City Lights. The adventure of a lifetime for a poet like me. When we began our contemporary American poetry series, City Lights Spotlight attacked Will at the outset, publishing his 2011 book, Compression and Purity, Volume 5. By then, Will had published over 20 books on various small presses, and almost 40 by now. And even New Directions, Lawrence's publisher, had begun supporting his work with the Sri Lankan Lobster Grove, followed by Across the Vapor Gulf, and most recently, Refracted Africa. It's been like watching the Big Bang in slow motion as Will's work has penetrated our cultural consciousness. Will's poetry is singular. No poetry in English even remotely resembles it in stylistic terms. What Will shows with Lamantia is accepting poetry as an experimental and experiential form of gnosis, grappling with the dense array of knowledge and history, a bricolage par excellence of this parrot vocabulary is gleaned from voracious reading across disciplines. So first and always a poet, he's unbound by generic concern, publishing novels, plays, essays, philosophy, aphorism. He's a painter and musician as well. He's a surrealist who critiques surrealism and forges it into something new. With the title poem of Divine Blue Light, he salutes the formative influence of the incendiary, visionary, improvisationary ethos of John Coltrane on his own highly combustible revolutionary poetics. There could be no more potent example of the survival of City Lights through almost 70 years in the recent pandemic than a reading like this. People of San Francisco and visitors from all points beyond, please join me in welcoming Will Alexander.
Thank you for giving me such a warm welcome, Derek, and thank you for hearing this evening, everyone. I wanted to start out by reading one of my favorite people in the world as a poet, great people. I was fortunate enough to be able to take a stroll through Lisbon, and I ended up at Fernando Pessoa's house. Revelatory for me because of the fact that fortunate connection with something from the past. They even had Pessoa's a simulation of Pessoa's old notebooks. By the way, they had so many things over there, all kinds of aboriginal projections, but they were all in this box that they had. It's a simulation of the original carting. There was so many papers in there. By the way, they're still carting out Pessoa's work. They're kind of translated across the world. He would scribble like, as a poet, I do on envelopes, short notes, and it was an endowing experience for me. So I was able to stay there that whole day and absorb the energies of his original home. But that's not the point of the poem. The poem is about the absorption of the poetic invisibility. As Octavio Paz once said, that if the soul was walking down the streets, he would disappear in front of your eyes. So this is the spirit in which one partakes in for me as a poet. And I'll read part of the poem because it's a fairly long poem, and I'll Synecdoche, I'll put the part for the whole just to start off because I'm going to do some other words that I don't want to just read and not bore you, but lull you into another state of onerics. So I'm gonna read this particular work here. This, by the way, this opens the volume. As sigil camouflaged by furious smoke and surcease, there remains your visage enigmatic and crystal, remaining hidden within occulted rainbow ravines. At one level, it is known that your appellation is Fernando Pessoa, born 13 June 1888. Of course, there exist the perfunctory tables of your chronicle, loss of your natural father at 5, your mother's remarriage and new placement in Durban, then university stay fueled by magnetic indifference, then life in rented rooms, then business letters translated from Portuguese to English and French, then criticism written in 1912, creative prose in 1913, and the following, your poetry, the heteronyms, their powers, their conspicuous agendas, including Alberto Cairo, Ricardo Reis, Alvaro de Campos, then one brief romance, the limited publication, then death by cirrhosis of the liver, a capsule, an unleavened symmetry, a migratory transit from my written realm and co-sensation. And why do I not emphasize the migratory? It's because we've always assumed kinetics that reveal ghosts emerging and re-emerging from Lisbon. Fernando being figurative in solarity, roaming a perch of invisible significance, retreating to an Olympic edge, only to return as visual briefings to emit perfection by ascent, by confounding observation, lit from within by inner magnificence, your inner eye, a refracted body of diamonds that form as an inner cyclonics, as true and concussive blood form. Your poetic forces, gazing via scattered combustion, understanding the rankings of minerals, not unlike an imaginary ostrich on fire with its primeval thesis, understanding precursors, perhaps flowing from vertiginous, from various forms, right with altering. Your personality, human microbial filtration, as anonymous, fantastic shift of various lingual maturation, being high art as cinder, as itinerant breathing codes that range from susurrant of inaudible deafening, and you reimagine the invisible, remaining silently and tumultuous, not unlike a primeval calamity, perhaps a burning richer as bird housing in your spirit, a Doran, Boreas, or a Quetzalcoatlus, your symbolic of your oversized lingual spell, spinning your animus of heteronyms, not as a gesture of looks or feral figurines. Perhaps in your case, an ashen boreal gift as projection that spins and declines its range, not as cellular density or bilinear architecture, yet never capable of fire, of galaxy and its range of 3 billion light years and counting, not as an anemic arch enemies to yourself, but heteronyms that emerge and glisten in themselves because you understood that the void continue to blaze, they continue to refract themselves, all the while rooted in themselves through and beyond an imaginary compost. Because the void blazes and gives strength, their psychic fracas bends and sculpts their own reception, so that their many personalities blazed and gave strength to living animals, to the boldness of their own psychic physique, the architecture as biography, through peculiar writing climates, they being integral burning ranges, bred to lateralize and soar within their own motion. You know what I'm gonna do? This poem takes so much time. I'm gonna have you read it. Sit up here and consider myself confident in this situation, but I'm gonna start by opening by reading some of the smaller works. Now, some of the smaller works in here have been also part of my aura, but the whole thing is this, that for me, a poem crystallizes itself in its own essence, not by size or similar to size. You know, my longest poem, it could be around here somewhere, the Brimstone Boat. I think it's not the Brimstone Boat, that's one of them. But the combustion cycle, it's over 600 pages. But for me, the poem organizes itself in the smallest crystal. I call it in the introduction nanograms, it's a billionth of a gram. So in other words, it's the purity of poetry, not the content or the size of poetry, or the big book. It's the essence of the book. And whatever grows from that, you know, in nature, they just not discovered, already been, but they know about some of the forms in the Cambrian period of the universe, of the human universe, of the living universe on Earth. And it was tubular, but it was always implying human beings across time. It's the Mr. Housewright talked about. Everything is always implying the human. So the human is always implying something else that it's been stopped at right now, and it's this form of late capitalism that is trying to regress into its prior form, like climbing back into a dream that no longer works. So in that spirit, I'm just going to read this small poem, Blaze of Riddles. Because the sun exudes a blaze of riddles, there exists a haze of optimal osmosis of protracted helium that bends via its forceless rule, via its maniacal translocation to alien ravines, to other planes of possibilities, interior to the sense of chronicle as uninhabited or pure activity. And this is basically, to me, the mirage of present life. We're talking about pure activity. But what about the activity of that which preceded us? Not on a human scale, but on a living scale. We inherited that situation from the universe, not through some kind of European exploitation of nature. But this is how we're talking about the totality of the universe. So it's strange that in this particular period, that with all these new suns being surveyed, all these uninhabited planes, that the Occidental mentality on Earth wants to revert to, not the palm, but to revert to the wasteland. 1923. Here we are over 100 years and going into this darkness that we don't know anything about. So with this, all that said in mind, I'm gonna read this one poem here called Liminal Memo. Facing first argumentative neural confrontations poised against self-inflicted ozone assaulted while living in my praise silo of indifference, knowing its void to be magically elevated as resonant chimera, as if fire were to erupt from subconsistent mountain ranges, as air and fabulous, knowing my figment be nothing other than transactional scintillation. To know the whole universe, to begin to know the whole universe. I think what the human race is trying under these conditions, but what about the indigenous universe of knowing how these things work? You know, there's a story about, which I've written on before, about the Dogon understanding of Series B. And there was a gentleman at MIT that had this derogatory understanding of that knowledge that Dogon had. He said they couldn't possibly have, as Carl Sagan, they couldn't have possibly known this because they didn't go to MIT Carl Sagan specifically said it must have been a Jesuit that gave that information. Ridiculous. This is how the mind is, the general mind is scattered. And so what I'm doing is trying to not repopulate that with what we're talking about now, but to begin to renew one's seminal energy across time and space. This is a 4 billion year enterprise. It's not a European enterprise. So this is where I'm working at right now with nanograms. You know, a billion, the energy in these poems is like a billionth of a gram. So it's relative to the invisible on this planet that I'm working at. So this is one of the poems, and these poems just come to me. And I don't mean it just come to me, but they build up and they extol themselves naturally. This is in a pitch dark saving house. Ridiculous in a pitch dark saving house, as alienated, spinning figment, I ambulate as galling vapor road, as phantoms blazing in and out of consciousness, as otherness, as alienated other, peering down on myself from a coeval sky, facing a scale that enters ashes, as a chronicle of non sequiturs, being raised from Saturnian winds, because there exists nothing except nothing that I can squander, nothing that curious bookcases brew, so that fire appears from urns, as if it were a territorial omen, as electrocuted scar, alive as magical utterance, as roughage self-specified in opening form onto random scholarly dust, thus asking myself the one-line equation about astonishment boils. So we're talking about what Sunra was talking about, real lingual equations, not specifically as the way Sunra did it, but the way that one's being works via equations, understanding things that one superficially doesn't seem to know, according to university standards. But this is how one knows about, you know, the eye forming 500 million years ago. We're talking about that kind of information that's imbued in the indigenous psyche. We're talking about this understanding that we know that happened in what the Egyptians called Wolsey, or the Greeks called Luxor, where education was brought up from the inside like a tree, the way it grows, not by class or race or whatever the external magnification was at the time, but it's from your own worth as a being, a human being. So this is the way I write, not from any kind of external kinds of particulates, but from the way that I feel that growth is taking place and transpiring. So I'm going to, on that note, talk about anterior speculation. Imagination equates with anterior speculation. In the higher states, one need not embrangle oneself via superimposed reductive oscillation. Should skills persist at this level, if they become capable of bringing into view alchemical stars that seemingly hamper or renew samsara, enabling evinces itself via indigenous understanding, being praxis that magically emanates and heightens into the zero field. Okay, to understand everything comes from the zero field. It doesn't come from something in 1648 that was done in Europe. You have to understand that. I think this book is coming out. It's called On Dario Hitler. Anybody ever heard of Dario? Maybe a few of you, I talked about it, people I know here in the audience, but Dario Hitler was an institution that was founded in Cairo in 1004, 1005, in present era by Khalid al-Hakim. And they took the principles of Wolsey or the principles of Luxor and brought the energy out of one's being. It was a public institution, but little has been known about it. I mean, she was an activist in Chicago, talked about it once, and I read it. I'll think of her name in a second, but she was an activist. She talked about Dario Hitler in passing. And this is the whole thing that I brought because I love the sound of the institution. But it was founded by a gentleman named Khalid al-Hakim in 1004. And all of the hierarchy, all the hierarchies were not superimposed, but brought up from the inside out, like the Egyptian economy of knowledge, which blossomed into all this expertise and this logistics of the infinite. And there's no logistics of the infinite, it just blooms. That's usually the term as I'm doing what I'll say in this next form, peripheral terminology. Peripheral terminology says not having embed ghosts or dust or forces that condone objective termination. I remain as peripheral numerology, not unlike the paradoxical sweltering that erupts from one's grasp, pre-cellular in origin. And this next poem is fragment, Blaze as a noble drift. Blaze as a noble drift, as mathematical drift that blazes with ciphers. I've listened to moons eclectically rise to conundrums, blaze and ascend, not as molecules or distributed torrents, but as vibrational mazes, as curious oneric cartography. These are shorter poems. Original language says is a blaze of birds as Hottentots, as density by phonemes. So for the origin of things, for me, is like this, the rooting of the seed and the way it exfoliates. It's not by, continuity by, what is continuity by appendage or just adding on a draft on top of superimposition. This is not a superimposition artist at superimposition. But you must know that art for me is writing poetry is ongoing. And for me, it's not something like this reading. As long as I've known about it, I don't plan my readings. I don't script and say, I'm going to read that, I'm going to read that. It's not a superficial cartography. So if I'm buzzing around between poems, that's the reason. And this was a poem according to Stella Locale. It's for Cian Proctor. Anybody know Cian Proctor? He's one of the latest space travelers. He took this poem to outer space. And it's been talked about a little bit, but anyway, I'm just going to explore Cian Proctor. Stellar locale, stellar scale, risen above wisdom, technical complexity, synonymous with a carriage of moons being vapor that rises and electrifies itself according to true interior functioning, according to voltage that submerged itself while soaring, according to balance as magnetic heightening, not as extension harassed beyond the wall of borders, but magnetism has ignited significance that partakes parsecs, that inspires revelation, being united first with health, where being conjoins with itself as aboriginal revelation. This is what we're talking about on Earth. It should be talked on Earth instead of talking about products, but original revelation of what you absorb from the universe, not what you particleize, I should say, synthesize from your understanding as a delimited understanding. And this is what Western science has become. It's a partial, as Naim Akbar put it, it's far, far less than the original Egyptian investigations. So these poems are like what we call nanograms. I may have mentioned about a particle of a gram being one, like a part of a part of a part of a gram. This is as close to being invisible as you can get. So this is an invisible domain for me. So when you get to the book, you can take a look at that. And I go all over the place because when it's free to go all over the place. And I don't say this in a random, in its limited way, but the way that one can travel across the universe. And not just take one example of one thing that one was working with, because all of it's there. In fact, there was this new, anybody ever heard of the coelacanth? It's this crazy fish that was just supposedly discovered in 1938 off the coast of South Africa. And they discovered one just recently out the waters of Santa Barbara. That was, we live in a perpetual universe. This is the universe where not even the reality of Jesus Christ can be named after only 2,000 years. So you start, and you talk about the spinning of the earth around the sun being 600 million years ago, being closer to the planet Venus, but yet you don't know that the origin of God on planet Earth. Not really. It's astonishing. It's astonishing. So ravenous spectral pores. By exercising cryptic scales of ponies and harems, I distract from whatever cause is pouring, vis-a-vis necessitous solar inferno, as mirrors reflect one's ravenous spectral pores that condense as a summary form of glass. So should I wander across its sums, I understand that my speculation issues from tornadic rivers, from ice-hot temperatures, so that I am both in sands and simultaneous concerning billions and billions of countless antecedents. Oniric liminal memo, and I'm just going through these poems at breakneck speed. By the way, this is not the best reading in the world, but I'm coming to this as a draft of my ongoing odyssey, not as some kind of conclusion, some kind of perfection. But everything has to be understood as an organic whole. And Julio Cortázar said, you don't try to copy yourself, be too perfect. Go over right in the margins psychologically. Garcia Lorca used to do that. He used to scribble on, he used to drink cold water and scribble on a blank piece of paper. It keeps the poetic current going. It works out that way for me. So I'm going to stick with this poem here. And by the way, these poems are difficult to read for me because I don't cherish my poetry. I don't do that. I just write it and go to the next thing. It's like I just write something and before I came over here.
Hmm.
Because it's not a versus animal that you stamp into the archives and you fossilize it. It's a living current. So you want to live inside the living current. So as anterior cartography, certain wavelengths appear not as beatific summation, but as feral anterior cartography where terror attempts to invade anterior translucency. Translucency being magical, being evolutionary lightning, being a curious spinning of drop and transparency that rises up from opposites. So incapability seemingly transpires where main grasses contort as untreated saliva. The latter being a spiraling truncation of oblique and dazzling darkness, possessing epileptic strength that is awkward and improvident, as if the sun had emptied, erupted, and gone ill. According to a higher rotational degree, I am able to view this first oil leakage from clarified detritus, from splintered metrics in sand. So how does seeming drop silently erupt and explore itself? Perhaps as a mist-focused cataract filled with dimming ocean parts, with nervous temporary eels akin to negated asparagus rooting. This result as botched butane uranium entanglement, as the flummoxed escalation with general visage of characterological explanation creating animated rifts along the equator of the Nile. Under this condition, can we say that the moon blazes from a cold and rigorous coffin, from a despicable but declaiming that it illuminates refractive properties from hell? Perhaps I remain an inhuman courier from Draco, from incelibate waste, where pro-carrying field via unveils obscurity that seems to not exist, where a phylum of tar is struck by an unimpeachable lightning that erroneously pre-exists and becomes green and black green. This being symmetry that has extolled itself as if seeing itself on a galleon of waters, guiding by reimagined birds by a syllabus prior to a cartography of rainbows. That's a part of a poem I'm going to read, and you can read the rest of this, read the book. And I'm going to go to this next poem here. It's called Anterior Speculation. Imagination equates with anterior speculation. In the higher states, one not embrangle oneself via superimposed reductive oscillation. Should skills persist at this level, if they become capable of bringing into view alchemical stars that seemingly hamper or renew samsara, enabling evinces itself via indigenous understanding, being praxis that magically emanates and heightens the zero field. These are elements that outside, for the most part, outside the general human scope of the noun-based reality of height and depth and particle is flow and human flow, I should say, human biography. These are poems that don't concern themselves with what happened on your, I'll say this, grandmother's back porch, or a skill of a dying civilization. We're talking about expanded psychology, trying to get to the expanded psychology so that there are certain stumblings along the way. As they say in African psychology, the stumble is to flow forward faster. So I'm gonna go here. This is called Blaze Fragment, being blazed as unknowable drift. Blazed as unknowable drift, as mathematical drift that blazes with ciphers. I listen to moons eclectically rise to conundrums that blaze and send, not as molecules, but distributed torrents, but as vibrational mazes, as curious phonetic cartography. There's something about the mind when it starts to open up to visibility in itself, is your dreams. You open up your whole field better. And that's something to this whole idea of the view of in the dream that one is conscious of dreaming. What do they call that? When the mind is aware of its dream. Lucid dream. And when you go into the lucid dream to such an extent that you go into the lucid dream, your conscious capacities re-arise. And so for me, this kind of terminology is part of this lucid dreaming for me, this kind of understanding of expansion that is curiously driven not by some kind of some kind of religious stamping is that how you should open up to the reality of yourself and how you just open up to reality. So all these suns explode out there. There's no rhyme or reason for anything. In fact, the universe has gotten so far out there now that they go back to this interesting cosmologist that passed away, Alan Sandage. He called this level of the universe biogeopoetry. So far beyond mathematical calculation. And it becomes like in this poem, the vertical terminology, not having embed ghosts or dust or forces that condone objective termination. I remain as peripheral terminology, not unlike the paradoxical sweltering that erupts from one's grasp, pre-cellular in origin. So we don't understand the whole universe because we're just in linear thinking, which is really outdated. But most people don't know it. There's a great book by a gentleman named Edward de Bono called Lateral Thinking. It's never been brought back to the print, but because it has exercises on how to get out of the linear mind. But people don't understand that understanding about a widening of the mind. And you can't do it by being correct. You don't want to be correct. So I'm not trying to be correct as I speak. And I don't want to read too long, but I'm going to take the title poem and begin to do a portion of it. John Coltrane, Divine Blue Light. I grew up on train, and I know train. I feel train, that's better than knowing train. But feeling train, I was fortunate enough, this is an anecdote, I was fortunate enough to be able to talk to Mr. Dolphy about John Coltrane's flute, and which was Eric Dolphy's flute. And Mr. Dolphy related to me that John Coltrane was going to take Eric's flute and learn to play it. And he did learn to play it. There's a tune called Ogunde that he did, and what was that? It's called Offering. He did one of his last albums, 1967. Anyway, Dolphy and Train were great correspondents, by the way. And before the technology was available, we don't have those conversations that he and Eric met in 1954. But this is this first poem I've ever written on Train. It's called Divine Blue Light, Sudden, Ungraspable Nomadics. Not the phantom galling, but the soils of Mount Meru, as quantum, as perpetual, as interdimensional kindling, its hemispheres colliding as sprinklage as osmosis, as sonic notation, alive as sonic commentary phantoms, understood unto themselves as stratospheric particulates, not merely as tense foundational structures, as a pronoun to be levied as simple sonic ramification. You understood this to be in the infinity of your heart, to be microscopic musical grammar, not unlike phosphates, as a syntax of symmetry resounding as an obverse mirroring of chords. Analogous to 16th notes rising and scattering of their own accord, much like the residue from diamonds that bake. Not simply shrill supplication as noise, but as spectral realms of themselves. Being sonic blinding bodies that rise and loop and gather themselves on the other side of themselves, not as artifact or translated merger, being exploration by exploration of summons, so that the sonic never wizens by pursuing entangled osmosis as complex Newtonian turquoise. It was on this plane that you and Dolphy squared private comment into thrilling electrical prophecy that both forged and scrambled light so that anchorage split apart and scattered, being across soil as interregnum, being blizzards of grammar that merely emitted from bodies, but sound as hail from unknown wizardry, that sired sonic thoughts and streams, understanding flow as transmuted acre. Can such emit itself from sounding boards of dust, never attempting to lean on criminal piety, all the while ignited by sonic invisibility as a subdivided notation, as dark and radiant, as chain reaction? Coltrane, this evokes its merit as a spontaneous rotation, and from your collective eye, a spontaneous emission of noises, you both symbols that once constructed Delilah, its fragile figurines ignited as from curious poles on Saturn being ionized, rotations spun from Rashid Ali, beckoning motifs from light from minuses of hail that emit from themselves anecdotal grammar. It's from that grammar, I picked up, I don't want to read the whole poem, you can read it yourself, but you get this smidgen, the portion that begins to radiate the internal spirit. You hear a note of train, and you hear the combination of India with Dolphy, and you hear this note of recognition. You don't have to hear sometimes the whole piece, but you just know it's there. You can see it radiate your system in a non-rational manner. This is how one wants to grow. It's the way that, like I said, trees grow. This is the way that nature foments itself, not by some superimposition. So these poems are not superimpositional oriented works. They just work. And I wanted to just probably finish off with a portion of this poem about Gertrude Bell. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Gertrude Bell. She symbolizes British imperialism. When all the domains of the Middle East and Africa were divided up, not in terms of any kind of organic notion, but because the colonial visibility that they were understood by. And this is what has ended up in the catastrophe that was Iraq, the catastrophe that was the Congo. So Gertrude Bell, and I'll read a portion of this too. Did I isolate your brilliance by pausing its causation as if you were an artifact or a scorched round shell? I could never name you as a seminal tactician, a queen mistress of hives. I would render your scale one of cryptic molecules that existed according to causality by Bob. The war diplomacy led to fiction, pre-cloned attempts at utopia, but always your raw, unaided colonizers, false things. Summoned from inherent maneuvering in your mappings, alive with pre-cloned attempts at utopia, alive with Holocaust to follow. You, as lone wolf, as primeval guile, as ignited and imperative with fortitude, as map maker, bifurcating desert terrain, as a spy insistently indicating names, to raise the region with foreshortened compassion, complexification being your orbit as danger, with its obligation to decipher the listening secrets, the lingual powers of the tribal wives, who clarified deficits, who understood your activity as glassy incremental flux, being subdivided with Lawrence in the Arabian Bureau, casting ripples that ignited future life and death, not as omnipotence, but strategy as colonial conformity. Because you ignited the blazing archaeology of mapping as transmission, future death was summoned. A cheerless residue was defined. Faisal Ibn Hussein, a broken monarch, understood principal aspects of your tremor. Thus, the void you instilled, harassed volatility, always subsumed within your demeanor. This is the problem of the modern world. And I wanted to, I don't want to go on too long, but I have another book here that just came out too, Phantom Africa, Refractive Africa. And I'm gonna do a charge on a little bit of the Congo. If I can find it. Yeah. Here we go. By the way, this book, I'll pull it out, start to see it underneath. I'm trying to do it surreptitiously, but you have to see it all the books provided. This was fun. I don't maybe it's whistle, but I'm almost forced to do something like that. It's Garrett so knowledgeably put on the book. This was a finalist for Pulitzer for you. And this is about Africa. You know, what Africa has been forced to deal with has been unconscionable and completely out of view. In fact, I was looking at all the flooding in Niger and Chad and Southern Sudan, never makes the news. Suffering transpires. So we're talking about the whole human family here. We're not talking about one part of Africa that they never touch in schools or in PhD circumstances. As a Kashif Sangoma, I appear into the Congo as a transpersonal witness, as incisively faceted tiger, squirming, having the powers of the shark, via forces that sculpt the lenticular as lightning, perhaps a telepathic wakefulness, perhaps magisterial conjuration, creating migrational vividness in my blood, thereby knowing the dangerous temper that is the Congo. Blood infected, days conundrum, horrific with grandeur, solemnly lit by rainy episodes of lightning. Thus, it puts it as tragedy, innate with microcentric suffering, its stressful indictment, its tertiary woundings, its camps, its darkened glossolalia at the height of bloody moonrise. As far as art markings, I am never plagued by micro-tessellation, by extended physical armament, as if under siege, listening to dysfunctional scallops. This being none other than spectral conflict, consulted by looming sentiment, by a spectral flame that allows the mind to consume itself as refraction, as the smoldering mental seed. Knowing resonance via Akashic transference, I spontaneously engage levitational fuels. Therefore, I engage magnetism and magically invade latitudes in formation by astonishment, by conundrum, by circuitous circulation, according to the realms of osmosis, non-aligned to the institutional as drama. And I won't continue this reading because this is read for yourselves. Synecdoche, part of the whole. But I'm gonna bring my co-collaborator up here tonight, Tongo Eisen-Martin. We all know Tongo, and we're gonna just have kind of a great conversation. Tongo, he does much better than I do. He just but when he's written down. This is difficult for me because of the fact that these terms of engagement here are so, in a certain way, rhythmical, not in possibly the way that Eric Dolphy understood his whole idea of playing father melody, where you break up fragments and make them flow. So here's the other part of the conversation here with Tongo. He can do what he can do best. We'll talk in a minute. Yeah. If you don't want to recite, we can just talk. It's up to you. Okay. Stop. Okay, thank you. We're gonna collaborate here as we normally do. This crucial time in the universe of being.
Last time we had this conversation, we were sitting in what, like a fast food restaurant.
Yeah, Dunkin' Donuts. It shows you that you can bring this information of context into any kind of situation that's available to you as long as the mind is working.
I'm curious about your take on the internal cultivation as is it a practice? Is it something you relax into? What is responsible for the ascension of your mind, brother?
I can't answer that with a practical answer, but I do know that this consciousness feeds into you in a non-linear way, and it comes out like in spells. It comes out in certain odd moments, and it has no time to it. I could be up here right now and want to write something. It gives you a torrent flow, continuous flow all the time, and everything you absorb becomes part of that flow.
So how does impulse play into that? Do you feel drawn in different directions?
Well, I'm drawn in all kinds of directions because I hear everything all the time. I hear sometimes irrelevant words. I used to take notes from all the relevances that I would hear. It's like Garcia Larga says, it's the first level you hear, and then there's another level that you hear. And you don't auto-replicate it, but it transmutes into a kind of, I call it a balance, a kind of poetic architectural balance.
Audre Lorde in Sister Outsider, one of those essays said something like when she was a child, she knew that she was thinking differently and in fact try to correct it. Did you ever have that kind of phase where you wanted to not be as kind of, didn't want to be as disjointed?
I didn't mind it because the fact that, you know, I didn't know I would be here, but I knew it was leading to something great because I had to fight my way through this situation. This what what do you call it? The superimposition of the American culture at that time.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I wasn't a performer. I'm a writer, so therefore it came out differently. And I had to wait until this has been applicable to this reality that we're in at the present time.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
What does all this information kind of like feel like to you? Does the information kind of come to you in moves?
It comes to me like at certain times, I will think of certain things that happen, like I'll think of a name or something, maybe just a common name, but because it's poetically rendered, it's soaked in poetry, I write everything down on scraps of paper. That, you know, you collect these scraps of paper and this charges your poetry like in odd ways.
How do your most personal relationships enter into these kind of equations of analysis?
It becomes like part of the flow. You don't break off the flow, but it becomes part of something. It's not that I'm focused on the personal, but the way that they flow into the situation that of consciousness. For me, so it's never like a personal flow as to what I thought about this person or that person, but the way that my consciousness flows, poetic consciousness flows.
And it's like expanding the kind of expanding personal outreach to even more collective, or making, you know, a mass personal. What do you think are kind of like guidelines of our collective evolution? So you're not just out here dancing alone.
I think about all the time because I want to emit this information out to the larger mind. I'm not interested in just keeping it to myself, but just not to put the books out, but to make sure that people can read them and maybe absorb them in their own way. So therefore, I'm not isolated in that sense. You know, there's people that understand this situation as you would know around the world. So it's not just like I'm by myself.
So what would you prescribe as kind of like first step for raising consciousness right now? Or next step, a few steps in there.
Well, there's not a linear way to deal with this. It's a very difficult situation. You know, you come in it through via mistakes or via weaknesses or whatever you want, however you want to term it. But it's a way forward into a new universe, a new way of hearing. It's like we talk about John Coltrane, the way he was like formulating himself through the private streets of sound of prior to Miles Davis, playing with Dizzy Gillespie in 1952. Or going through that transition. In other words, you have to grow as to what you are, and to you don't just hail from perfection, you just jump out as a perfect being.
It's interesting. You know QR Hand Jordan?
I do know, I knew QR, yeah.
He said the exact same thing, man.
Yeah.
When I was crying to him. Like, I can't get these people on the same page as some organizing effort that was going terrible. And what you have to keep in mind is that organizing is not linear.
It's non-linear, you know, I knew QR, and you know, he emphasized that as a life victim. That's what we're talking about. He's a life victim. That's what poetry is, a life victim. It's not a perfect victim. I'm gonna look back and see how I stumbled in this particular beating, or in this particular one particular episode or another, but it's the general life journey you're on.
Back on Coltrane, what do you make of the latter part of his journey in music?
Well, it's interesting, you know, I'm not a scholar, but the fact is, I think that with the album John Coltrane Quartet plays, he lost some of the audience because he was jumping off into the cosmic view.
Mm.
Not that he wasn't there already. I mean, Africa, India, man, we can say about that stuff. You know, we're talking about another level of consciousness that seemed to cancel out McCoy and great poets, man. I just love McCoy. But the fact is that he figured that Alice was spreading the sound into the universe, and Rashid Ali was spreading the sound into the universe. So we're talking about spreading the sound into the universe, and hence we're at the level of the Webb telescope and what it's spreading the universe now into all these other suns. But the problem with modern astronomy is that they're trying to replicate this problem here on Earth. It can't be done. You know, TRAPPIST and some of these other parts of the universe, they have seemingly functioning planets that they can adhere to psychologically, but it's not a perfect science. We just know things, but it's not a perfect science. That, you know, if another kind of mind got into the present time, you know, like I've written on the Islamic Renaissance. Abu Said Zinzari, I may have it wrong. He was discovering the amplifications of what Copernicus did 500 years later. So, you know, we're talking about the way a mind works, not the way that it is at the present time.
Are there some physicists you could recommend? Like, who would you read or encourage us to read? Somebody you think has a good grasp on the cosmos?
Well, there is a popular book by, what's his name, Michio Kaku, things like that. You know, the revelations of Ernst Mach, or, you know, of course, Einstein and de Broglie and all these people. But there's books on it, and there's something that I can't get to right away. This is Albanian lady in the South, in Carolina, is talking about the multiverse. I can't think of her name right now, but there was a gentleman here at Stanford that talked about the multiverse years ago. He was Russian, and I can't think of his name right now, but he was talking about.
It's supposed to be alternative, super symmetry or something. So what do you think? The multiverse and super symmetry?
We don't know. We really don't know. We take the process with some kind of knowledge, but the process is a mystery to them too. In fact, we're dealing with this as we speak as living beings. This is what's interesting about the artists and John Coltrane projecting all these far out amplifications, bringing them in sonically and bringing their information in terms of illuminating the riddle. He said, cleaning the mirror all the time.
Is there any kind of field of study or inquiry that you are like brand new in right now that's interesting you?
I'm always brand new. I never get. Like Malcolm said, you never want to be an expert on anything. You keep learning and processing and learning, even in not a half-hearted manner, but not in a full. You're never an expert. It's a process of understanding yourself by your endeavors themselves. You just, like somebody who I don't really admire, but Robert Frost used to say that, you know, a poet was like walking across a field with your boots on, picking up thorns. That's what a poet just does. He just picks up things.
What would you say a poet is?
Well, I would concur with that, because you're bringing in things, you're bringing in the unknown all the time. In yourself, you're bringing yourself into the unknown. And that sometimes isn't as comfortable, because you never, within your culture, you never think that's maybe the right thing to do. But you just do it anyway. You just break the carapace, break the shell open and let the organism flow out.
How do you recommend people read poetry?
They need to feel it. You need to feel language, not to know language, to feel it. As you feel it, you begin to see the cortical mind is, to me, a secondary mind. The rational mind is only a secondary mind. It's not the, shouldn't be the primary mind. It's kind of like eating, what do you call it, those, the grapes and the parts of the meal, not the whole meal. So we want the whole thing to be part of the whole structure of health, psychic health. This is the goal of psychic health. Poetry is psychic health.
And if, right, so like if you know, like in they call it physical therapy, right? Sometimes the objective of the session is not even to get the muscle stronger, but just to get it to twitch.
You get it to moving, get things to moving in yourself.
So what would be those training wheels for somebody who's sitting there right now, like, I feel.
The training wheels is embrace that which you don't know. Begin to try things out. Sometimes you just don't know what's going on. You take that beat, you will get into that situation, and as you go on, you begin to make yourself a certain kind of an expert. I wouldn't say an expert, but you can become more confident and more palpable with your ability to execute.
Like read outside of paradigms of accomplishment.
Well, you know, theory of scientific revolutions by what's his name?
Who?
Thomas Kuhn, yeah. He talks about sometimes the person that has the most insight is not the expert who knows more about the field, but sometimes the outsider that's circulating around that point begins to have the creativity to go and crack the paradigm. Crack the middle.
Do you see an evolution in your writing over time? Like, how does that, do you see eras or like how would you visualize your journey as a writer?
It's like Eric Dalton said, he always been curious. Non-linearly instructed. You know, you really don't know sometimes. It's like he did this interview once where he said that everybody says, well, he sounds the same, but they didn't know the intricacy from what he was going through with this whole thing called clank farming melody. That's his term, where you break things up and make them flow again. It's in his own workshop. That's why Mingus loved him, because he could improvise and sort of drop of a hat on these other levels that was, Philly Joe Jones said it, Eric Dalton and John Coltrane knew their instruments.
Is there a trick to transmuting strategies from other disciplines to writing?
Yeah, there is. There's not a trick, but you know, you begin to absorb things in such a way that the lyric flow is so strong that it can melt the resistances between genres and begin to flow as a form of wider understanding.
And the thought just occurred to me, everybody doesn't have access. Does anybody have a question for him? You know what I'm saying? You're not gonna get this.
Doing good. I get started. Could you talk a little bit about, since we're here at City Lights, the trace elements of Philip Loman's piano?
Yeah, when I discovered Philip, it was amazing because he was somebody that actually wrote in English. But with consciousness, that's what I discovered was his consciousness. And when I met him, it was unbelievable because I was a person that just traveled up here just to see people, you know, like Bob Kaufman and Philip, in particular Philip, you know, and so we got a chance to talk and walk around this very area many years ago and look for Bob Kaufman in the streets. And we discovered him later on at Nimi Tchaikovsky's at Harwood Alley. And I found out that Bob was in the house with us, and we read together the Ancient Rain before it was a manuscript. So Bob was an amazing. I never talked to Bob because he was on that mission of silence. But I did see him one afternoon down the street here, where he almost disappeared in front of my eyes. And I like to talk about Priscilla, you know, but he was just gone. It was amazing. I still remember that, but he was an amazing figure, man, a seminal figure. And that's why I'm here in San Francisco, because I'm saying something that he did a line about Los Angeles being a kind of a magical joke. I'm not saying that to put down LA, but the fact is this is where all the concentration, poetic concentration seems to exist in this country. That and in New York too, but San Francisco in particular, it's very, very charismatic and very, I feel welcoming to what I do.
Did you ever see John Coltrane?
You know, I never saw Train. The only thing I can give you is an anecdote. I was a little too young for that, but you know, I was able to sit in the same chair that John Coltrane sat in while I talked to Mr. Eric Dolphy Sr. about Eric's flute and John Coltrane's reality. So we exchanged on that level. He had this Panamanian accent. He said, "Hey, son, you see that chair over there? John Coltrane sitting in that chair." That's exactly how he said it. I just went over there and sat and talked to him in that room.
You have the questions for the oracle. What do you make of this? What do you make of this political moment?
John Coltrane?
What do you make of what do you make of 2022?
This is, as a theorist, we say late capitalism, but I would say another dimension that we're in a gone society. Because all it wants to do is repeat itself. I go to the Google headlines, but not to get just information, but to look at the trend of what's under all the stories. And it's a done deal. We're talking about water shortages, we're talking about other levels of desperation transpiring across whole regimes of people across the planet. And you still want to keep, you know, games going on, you still want to keep fashion situations going on, but it's at another level right now.
So what do you make of this kind of addiction to normalize mass murder?
It's not good. That's just a simplified, but it's insidiously destructive. Because people like in Africa, the Congo, we're talking about, and Somalia, they don't count as beings. Malcolm X said years ago that, you know, if something happened, and I was asking this, he was Pakistani minister, from near India. He was talking about, you know, what I was asking him what would happen if all these destructive things happened in central London. It would be a catastrophe, but it's not a note when it happens in the so-called, which they used to call the third world. It's something that has to be understood as part of the humanity. It needs to be understood, but not that it will be understood, but it is a need to understand the whole rather than the part.
The brother DJ Césaire, that he said it like in an interview, like, you know, everybody knows what the Ukraine flag looks like, but nobody knows what the Sudan flag looks like.
Exactly, that's something that you know, it's an interesting point. That's an interesting point because everybody knows about And I know people, in fact, I've had some work translated into surrealism. But why don't you know about the Congo? Why don't you know about GERD? Why don't you know about all these African languages, about these African languages? It's never given the kind of understanding that needs to be given, and never given its due, so we can take it seriously. I don't know if anybody knows Howard French's work about the Born in Blackness. It's a new book, and he talks about the situation of not taking Africa seriously, that the Chinese have taken seriously in terms of actually putting in infrastructure that the Western countries have never provided. But to understand the Chinese position is complicated because they do want the resources out of Africa, but they're doing it in such a way that it looks hypnotically cooperative, yeah, it's a good way. Cooperative, but it's a classically tricky world. Dangerous world, and it's hard to put your hands around it if you listen to me all the time.
On the other side of that contradiction, what is your kind of description for the diaspora?
The diaspora is keep, as Dr. Horn says, keep moving your work as far out as you can move it out there in the world around, not just around the corner, but out there in the world. And with a vision, so that the work becomes medicinal, not didactic. Once it's medicinal, then you can begin to, create some kind of health into the system. It's slower, but it works.
Hey, Tongo, can I ask you a question? I want to ask about the. Well, I'm trying. I want to ask about the title of the book. Why Divine Blue Light?
Because, in fact, I was going to give it another name, but Garrett picked it up, and I just went with it. And we picked it up here at City Lights, and we began to brew and work with me because of the fact that it had this charismatic feeling to it. But this is what I was actually going to name the book under the poem I read by Pessoa. But the thing is to bring this incandescent energy into the title was very, very good for me. Good for the book, I should say.
Coltrane has been equated with Krishna, the blue saint who can dance.
Yeah. Well, the mother talked about that, Ramara Bendo talked about that when you get to the divine regions, there's a bluish tint that transpires.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You got a last word for him?
Yeah, any more comments, anything like that?
With some of your titles and images here, cartography, geography, the liminal regions. You have a certain age in your element in your travels. If you travel, are there any like geographically speaking, certain places you've been to or visited that have a certain card, like an elected place that is a lyrical or super memorable lyrical? Getting at?
Did everybody hear the question? The question was, in your travel, are there any places geographically that you have found to have a lot of energy, more energy that strikes you?
I was told that energy was available in Pondicherry, but I never went. But I found that something was in me that inspired this kind of energy all the time. I mean, I tried to write in New Mexico from something I saw, but it would never really transpire, it would never come out. But to be in this state of poetry all the time, like a river of poetry, you sometimes can emerge from that river and begin to partake of the magnetism of the moment. So I'm always partaking of the magnetism of the moment.
have quite a breadth of vocabulary. And your poems, I noticed there's a certain melody, and I wonder if you consciously write like that, or is it just something that, you don't think about it?
It's the way trees grow, the way you see leaves. It's like an African fractal. Fractals didn't emerge from Mandelbrot, but they were in Africa. Long before Mandelbrot existed, they're natural to the endemic locale. In fact, there's a gentleman named Ron Eglash who talks about African fractals. It's a good book, you should take a look at that. But it was a natural process for me where you sometimes along my way, I was always thinking I was making a mistake about who I was. And here I am.
What does it feel like when you're editing your poetry?
I don't edit that much.
Okay.
It just comes out. But I'm not saying it, you do, because Garcia Lorca talked about hearing, the levels of hearing, the initial hearing, and then you get to that other level where it settles in. And I don't see that you correct, but you inspire, and poetry inspires itself to transmute or to expand itself naturally. And you don't just throw stuff out right away, but just let things sit and let them develop it, and they do that on their own.
How often do you practice writing, and how does the development of your writing affect the way that you understand reality and approach these subject matters?
Well, first of all, I'm at a stage where I just write. And in these things, the writing develops on its own, because you so into it, it begins to self-expand, like the way you give medicine to a body. It helps the body to perform its own natural reality. So that's how it heals itself. Or that's how you lingually heal yourself. You heal the language that way. The other language heals you. So you don't didactically.
So much of the poetry seems to be based off intuition, kind of feeling the universe in yourself. And I was wondering, how you dance between maybe reading historical context, educating yourself, and then what you're feeling inside, and how it might inform the other, and which one you favor more.
I don't favor anything, but everything goes with the flow. And when I'm writing a lot, sometimes I don't read a lot. It's kind of like Swami Vivekananda, that you pick up things that you don't know by knowing them, by practices. But you have to get to a certain stage where you get beyond just the external superimposition of knowledge, but it flows through you. But you have to work. Poetry's hard work, man. Tongo will tell you how tough it is.
You write, you just have the ambient sound of light in the background, or you ever put on a Sun Ra record to get things moving along? How do you?
No, I just move along on my own, but I have done that. I have done, but at a certain point, it's like a rocket goes up into outer space, it drops off all the stages at a certain point.
How do you know when to end the poem? Like, do you like?
Yeah, it ends itself. Yeah, it's an uncanny feeling you get, it's time to go somewhere else. Because it's coming back, it's not gonna just, I gotta write all this. You don't do it like that, it's non-linear, it's just you just drop off and the tree continues to grow.
Who are the living poets whose work is the most important to you?
Well, there's probably, I'm sitting next to one here. And we're, it's a lot of people here in the Bay Area that I've been working with for a long time. And talk historically, like Lamantia, Andrew Duran, who I've known for a long time, and we collaborate, in fact, we're gonna be playing some music soon. And this is not a it's a process. I don't like to name names, there are so many. There are so many, and I've written about them too. I did this book here, this Refracted Africa, was simultaneously published in London, and by Granton in London. And I named a lot of people that felt affinity with, but it spontaneously pops up when I do blurbs and, you know, appreciations, and I'm doing a book of essays. I've done a book of essays, and I'm doing another book of essays that's coming out in January or February from Litmus in New York. And you know, the essays, like poetry, this comes from different directions. And I see Carlos Lara, who wrote on this book, things like that. Now, people like that, Jeffrey Yang, and I know I'm leaving all kinds of people out, because in this kind of environment, you don't think about everything you know, but there's a crowd in front of me, so, but I'll just leave it at that.
How do you become a nonlinear thinker? How do you become a nonlinear thinker? Yeah.
The African thing says to stumble is to fall, stumble forward is to move, stumble forward faster. I've stumbled my whole life. So I was never successful in the other world, although I could use that other mind. But use the mind that I can really use is as a non-linear. And this whole idea of Edward de Bono of lateral thinking, if you can find that book, there's some exercises on it. It's interesting. It's interesting they never brought it back into print. I found out about it via the great filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky. And you know, it just went from there. So I teach it to my students.
Somebody mentioned Blue Train. I was in church Sunday and somebody mentioned your name and invited us here.
Oh, yeah, we're talking with Solomon. Yeah, thank you for coming. In fact, we did a panel together some years ago with I can't think of the guys I think it was over in East Bay. We did a panel. This is about 09 or something like that. Yeah, but you know,
You, right?
yeah, it was me. Yeah. Yeah. Said something about Blue Train. That's a great record.
Well, somebody said that they heard that Coltrane was bad to Christian, yeah. And I know where you heard that because it came out of my mouth.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, the mother in our Bindle circle talked about the divine level of consciousness taking on this tinge of blue light. That's where I got that from, divine blue light. Yeah,
But you didn't get it from Blue Train.
I didn't get it from Blue Train. No, I did not get it from Blue Train. By the way, the mother has these journals that they're hard to get. Year by year from 57 on through to the time she passed away in 1972. That has the moment by moment chronicling of this consciousness. That can be gotten a hold of, you know. Maybe we'll talk about that at some point, but these are valuable documents of how to deal with what I think somebody, Daniel Sheehan, was talking about the 8th chakra, the non-physical chakra taking over, where we can get through the times that are coming upon us.
I would like to just say this is a grand idea for a church. I feel very sanctified, very holy. I feel like something really great is happening in terms of transformation, involvement in my consciousness. And I think that I'm with the St. John Coltrane, Will I Am, African Orthodox Church Global Spiritual Community. And what we've been doing is trying to deal with how do we shake off colonialized Christianity?
Mhm.
And how do we get to the point that we understand the power of sound? And do we, when we talk about St. John Coltrane, do we really understand that he not only spoke loudly with his horn, and
Of course.
with sonic healing, but he also had some very wise things to say.
Always, always.
And I love the way you embraced it. And I think my listening to John Coltrane helps me to keep up with the wisdom that you've been spitting. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening and absorbing. Let's keep going. Trina always said, keep on polishing the mirror.
Yeah, keep cleaning in the mirror.
Always sound.
So, in conclusion, what is the meaning of life?
There's no answers. There's no answers. It's a process of trying to construct itself. And I was like recently did a small book on tearing down original sin. St. Augustine, and that, you got that from, I guess it was from his mother Monica. That's what was some orthodox thinking,
Yeah.
but the fact is to get to a point where one is free. Like Henry Miller said, to throw off all the archives and all of that stuff. And, they went into the original so-called tomb of the so-called Savior. And they found nothing in it. So we go back to the 344 AD, it was Council of Nicaea, as Alan Watts says, they made it all up.
Nobody had.
Everybody, please give it up.
Thank you for joining us.
Congratulations, Tongo, you're a righteous interlocutor. Thank you, sir. So, for those of you who are watching on Zoom, we have posted links in the chat, so please do pick up books there. Thank you again for joining us. Everyone here, we're actually not books at the counter, both Tongo and Will will be signing. This event has been made possible by the Civil Rights Foundation, which is one of the reasons why we're here right now. They are responsible for the event series and encourage deep literacy through our publications, through events like this one, and educational outreach. So thank you all. Please be well, be safe, and hope to see you soon.